In the last decade of the 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula produced something the world had not seen before, a generation of professional soldiers with nowhere left to fight. The Reconquista, the 800-year campaign by Christian kingdoms to reclaim the peninsula from Muslim rule, ended in 1492 with the fall of Granada, the last Islamic emirate in Spain. In the same year, a Genoese navigator sailing under the Spanish flag reached the Bahamas searching for a western route to Asia, and found instead a continent that Europe did not know existed. The timing was not coincidental. Thousands of veterans, men who had spent their lives in military camps, who knew nothing but the sword and the siege, suddenly found their profession obsolete in a pacified Spain. The New World offered them a second war, and with it the possibility of everything Spanish society denied them at home: land, wealth, title, and the particular honor that came from conquest in the service of God and crown. They called themselves conquistadors, conquerors. History has not found a more accurate word for what they were. Who were the conquistadors? The popular image of the conquistador as a steel-armored knight representing the Spanish monarchy is largely wrong. The crown rarely funded expeditions directly. Instead, it issued licenses, capitulations, granting private individuals the right to conquer and govern territories at their own expense, in exchange for a portion of whatever they found. The men who sailed were entrepreneurs of violence, risking their own money and lives on the gamble that there was something worth taking on the other side of the ocean. The social composition of these expeditions was more varied than is generally understood. At the core were the hidalgos, minor nobles, often the younger sons of families whose estates passed by law entirely to the firstborn. They had names and swords and nothing else. The New World was their only path to the land and status that birth had promised but law had withheld. Alongside them were professional soldiers, veterans of the Italian wars and the Reconquista, men of considerable tactical skill and considerable cynicism. And below them, the bulk of every expedition, were the genuinely desperate, ruined farmers, failed tradesmen, petty criminals, men who had nothing to lose and understood that perfectly well. The average conquistador was between 20 and 30 years old. He was driven by what historians compress into three words: oro, gloria y Dios, gold, glory, and God. These were not separate motivations that happened to coexist. They were experienced as a single, indivisible imperative. To enrich himself, to make his name immortal, and to do both in the service of Christ, whose enemies in the New World were as real to him as the Moors had been to his father. Every expedition also carried priests and friars, Dominicans, Franciscans, Jesuits, whose official purpose was the salvation of indigenous souls and the maintenance of Christian conduct among the soldiers. Their practical success in the second task was, by any honest assessment, limited. The burning of the ships. In 1519, Hernán Cortés departed Cuba for the Mexican coast in direct defiance of orders from the island's governor, Diego Velázquez, who had rescinded the expedition's authorization at the last moment. Cortés sailed anyway. He was committing an act of insubordination that, if the expedition failed, would result in his arrest and probable execution. He understood this. His solution was to make failure impossible by eliminating the means of retreat. After landing on the Mexican coast and establishing the settlement of Veracruz, which he then made legally independent of Cuba by the creative legal fiction of having its residents elect him their commander, Cortés ordered his ships run aground and stripped of their fittings. The hulls were scuttled. The sailors, now with no ships to return to, became soldiers. The message to his men was unambiguous: there is no going back. We go forward, or we die here. It was an act of strategic theater as much as practical calculation. Cortés was not simply removing the option of retreat, he was performing his own commitment to the enterprise in terms his men could not misunderstand. A commander who burns his own ships believes he will win. The psychology of the gesture cascaded through the army. They had followed a man willing to destroy his own means of escape. They would follow him anywhere. Cortés then turned inland, seeking allies. He found them in the Tlaxcalans, a people who had resisted Aztec domination for generations and nursed a hatred of Tenochtitlan that ran deeper than any fear of the Spanish. After an initial battle that ended with Cortés's forces severely tested, the Tlaxcalans switched to alliance. They would provide the bulk of the force that besieged and destroyed the Aztec capital. Not as auxiliaries, but as the primary army, with the Spanish as the technologically advanced but numerically tiny leading edge. Why 500 men could destroy an empire? The question that haunts the history of the conquest, how did a few hundred Spaniards overthrow civilizations of millions? Has a complex answer that resists any single explanation. Steel was part of it. Toledo blades, steel breastplates, and crossbow bolts penetrated the obsidian-edged weapons and quilted cotton armor of Mesoamerican warriors in ways that reversed every calculation about relative strength. The macuilhuitl, the Aztec war club set with volcanic glass blades, was a devastating weapon against unarmored opponents. Against a man in a steel cuirass, it was far less effective. The Spanish were not invulnerable, but they were significantly harder to kill than anything the indigenous armies had previously fought. Firearms and artillery contributed more through psychology than lethality. The arquebus was slow to reload, inaccurate, and unreliable in wet conditions. But the sound and smoke of gunfire, and the fact that it killed at a distance through means that seemed to have no physical cause, produced a terror response in populations with no prior experience of the technology. The same was true of horses, absent from the Americas since the end of the last ice age. In the first encounters, indigenous peoples who had never seen a mounted rider perceived horse and rider as a single entity of supernatural character. Once that perception was corrected, the practical advantages of cavalry on open ground remained significant. The Spanish also brought dogs, large mastiffs and alanos trained for combat, sometimes armored in leather, used to pursue and terrify. And they brought something far more lethal than any of these, disease. Smallpox arrived in the Americas before most conquistadors did, traveling ahead of the Spanish presence along trade routes and through populations with no acquired immunity. The epidemic that struck Tenochtitlan in 1520 killed the Emperor Cuitlahuac after 80 days in power and may have reduced the city's population by a quarter before the siege even began. Across the Americas, epidemic disease did more damage to indigenous resistance than any weapon the Spanish carried. But perhaps the most decisive factor was political. The empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes were not unified nations. They were tribute systems, held together by force, resented by the peoples they had conquered. Cortés did not conquer the Aztec Empire with 500 Spaniards. He allied with the empire's enemies and used Spanish military technology to tip a civil war that was already latent. The Tlaxcalans who stormed Tenochtitlan were not helping Spain. They were settling accounts of their own. Pizarro and the room full of gold. Francisco Pizarro was, in almost every biographical detail, the opposite of Cortés. Where Cortés was educated, articulate, and politically sophisticated, Pizarro was illiterate, a former swineherd from Extremadura who had come to the New World in his youth and spent decades in obscurity before finding his moment. He could not sign his own name. He commanded men through physical presence, endurance, and a ruthlessness that even his contemporaries found remarkable. In 1532, Pizarro arrived in the Inca city of Cajamarca with 168 men and a piece of timing that could not have been engineered. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters of the world, had just emerged from a devastating civil war between two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, each claiming the throne. Atahualpa had won. He was camped outside Cajamarca with an army of perhaps 80,000 warriors, resting after the campaign. He agreed to meet the Spanish, apparently without concern. What threat could 168 men pose? The answer was given on November 16, 1532. Pizarro's men concealed themselves around the square of Cajamarca. A Spanish friar presented Atahualpa with a Bible and demanded his submission to the Christian God and the Spanish crown. Atahualpa, who had no frame of reference for either, reportedly examined the book, heard no voice from it, and threw it to the ground. The friar declared this sufficient justification. The Spanish charged from their hiding places, artillery fired into the packed crowd, cavalry drove through the emperor's attendants, none of whom were armed, since weapons were forbidden in the Inca ruler's presence, and within 2 hours, Atahualpa was a prisoner. His army, leaderless and paralyzed by the incomprehensibility of what had just happened, did not attack. Atahualpa understood the Spanish quickly enough. He offered a ransom. A room 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, filled with gold to the height of a raised hand, and filled twice over with silver. Runners went to every corner of the empire, and the gold arrived, temple ornaments, royal objects, ceremonial vessels representing centuries of Inca craftsmanship. The Spanish melted it all into bars. Then they tried Atahualpa on charges of idolatry and fratricide, convicted him, and executed him by strangulation in July 1533. The ransom had been paid. It made no difference. The myth that killed thousands, El Dorado. Among the many legends that drove the conquest, none was more persistent or more lethal than El Dorado, the Golden One. The original story was specific and, in its original form, true. Among the Muisca people of what is now Colombia, there was a ceremony in which a new ruler, covered from head to foot in gold dust, paddled a raft to the center of Lake Guatavita and submerged himself, washing the gold into the water as an offering to the gods. European accounts transformed this ceremony into a city, a place called El Dorado where gold was so abundant it was used as building material, where the streets were paved with the metal and the temples plated with it. The search for El Dorado sent expedition after expedition into the interior of South America throughout the 16th century and beyond. Gonzalo Pizarro, Francisco's brother, led one of the most disastrous, marching east from Quito in 1541 with more than 4,000 men and 4,000 pigs. Within a year, he returned to Quito with fewer than 80 survivors, having found nothing. His second-in-command, Francisco de Orellana, had detached from the main force to search for food and instead floated the entire length of the Amazon River, roughly 6,500 kilometers, becoming the first European to traverse it, naming it after the warrior women his party claimed to have fought along its banks. El Dorado was never found because it did not exist in the form the Spanish imagined. The ceremony at Lake Guatavita was real. The city of gold was not. But the legend outlasted the conquest by centuries, drawing English, German, and Dutch expeditions as late as the 18th century into the same jungle that had swallowed the Spanish before them. In 1595, Sir Walter Raleigh sailed to the Orinoco Delta specifically to find it. He found a river. The legend proved more durable than any of the men who chased it. The voice against the conquest. Not every Spaniard who crossed the Atlantic accepted what he found there as justified. The most significant dissenter was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who had initially participated in the conquest of Cuba as a settler and encomendero, been granted indigenous laborers in the standard colonial arrangement, and then experienced a conversion so complete that he spent the rest of his long life, he died at 92, as the most persistent and effective critic of Spanish colonial practice in the 16th century. His Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, completed in 1542, was addressed directly to King Charles V and described in precise, horrifying detail the systematic murder, enslavement, and torture of indigenous populations across the Caribbean and Central America. Las Casas was not a dispassionate reporter, he was a polemicist, and some of his numbers have been questioned by later historians. But the fundamental reality he described was not invented. His advocacy resulted in the new laws of 1542, which formally prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people and attempted to phase out the encomienda system, the arrangement by which indigenous communities were assigned to Spanish settlers as a labor force. The laws were only partially enforced. In distant colonies, colonial interests were often stronger than metropolitan legislation. But they represented the first time a European colonial power had legislated against the enslavement of the people it was conquering, in direct response to the testimony of a witness. Las Casas's campaign also had an unintended consequence. the collapse of indigenous labor supply accelerated the transatlantic slave trade, as African captives were imported to replace the workers the new laws were meant to protect. The Columbian Exchange, what the world traded. The most lasting consequence of the conquest was not political but biological. The contact between the old world and the new set in motion an exchange of organisms, plants, animals, diseases, and microbes, that permanently altered the ecology of both hemispheres and, through its effects on agriculture and population, shaped the modern world. From the Americas to Europe and beyond traveled the potato, the tomato, maize, cacao, tobacco, the sweet potato, the chili pepper, vanilla, and the turkey. The potato alone transformed European agriculture, calorie-dense, storable, growable on marginal land. It fed populations that had previously been vulnerable to grain failures. Historians credit the potato with enabling the population growth of 18th and 19th century Europe. The tomato remade Italian cuisine. Cacao became chocolate. Tobacco became one of the most widely traded commodities in the world within a century of its introduction. In the other direction went wheat, rice, sugar cane, horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens, and, invisibly, the diseases that would kill more people in the Americas than all the warfare of the conquest combined. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, the indigenous populations of the Americas had no immunity to any of them. Estimates of pre-Columbian population range from 40 to 100 million. By 1600, that population had been reduced by 80 to 90%. In some regions, the reduction was total. The demographic catastrophe of the post-Columbian Americas remains one of the largest in human history. What the conquest made. The conquest ended, in the sense of active military campaigns, by the close of the 16th century. What replaced it was a colonial system. Viceroys, bureaucrats, tax collectors, plantation owners, that was in many ways more efficient at extraction than the conquistadors had been, and far more durable. The Spanish colonial empire lasted, in most of its territories, until the early 19th century. What the conquest created, beyond the political structures, was a civilization that had not existed before, Latin America. The mixing of Spanish, indigenous, and African populations produced languages, architectures, religions, and cultures that are neither purely European nor purely pre-Columbian but something genuinely new, the most visible result of a collision between worlds that had been developing separately for 15,000 years. The silver that flowed from the mines of Potosí in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico to the treasuries of Spain, and from there into the circuits of global trade. Triggered what economists call the price revolution, a sustained inflation across Europe driven by the sudden abundance of precious metals, which disrupted medieval economic structures and helped create the conditions for the commercial capitalism of the 17th century. Spain, paradoxically, was among the least well-positioned to benefit. The silver passed through Spanish hands into the pockets of the Italian and Dutch bankers who held the crown's debts, and into the costs of the religious wars that consumed the empire's resources for a century. The conquistadors are among the most difficult figures in history to assess without either sanitizing or demonizing. They were men of extraordinary physical courage and endurance, capable of sustained effort under conditions that would have broken most people. They were also perpetrators of mass atrocities, destroyers of civilizations that had taken millennia to build, and architects of a colonial system whose demographic consequences were catastrophic. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the difficulty of holding them together without collapsing into a simpler story is precisely what makes this period of history worth studying. The world they made, the world of the Americas as it has existed for the past 5 centuries, is the world we still live in. Its pleasures and its injustices both trace back to the moment when Cortés set fire to his ships on a Mexican beach and decided there was no going back.